What is the reason?
Because the window is not activated.
Just first click. This is active.
Next question. What is it? So, I will present a paper focused on the problem of Russian big business, and more particularly on the reasons why Russian big business is not interested, typically is not interested in long-term investments and prefers short-term investments in productive capacities in Russia and savings abroad, mainly in the West. I think that data show that investments of Russian corporations are inferior, and in order to understand what are the reasons, we should use the framework of center-periphery approach, world system approach to the world economy, because I believe that the place in the world economy determines the major interests of the ruling class over a capitalist society, and this could be understood only on the basis of this approach. And I use Marxian approach to capitalism and introduce post-Keynesian understanding and approach to the theory of a firm. In this wider framework, I would like to interpret some facts about current Russian capitalism. There are lots of data on very bad investment behavior, inefficient investment behavior of Russian big business. And particularly, I would like to emphasize that surveys of Russian managers demonstrate that in 2000s, which are considered as a time of great economic recovery in Russia, from 45 to 79% of Russian enterprises undertook any investments. And currently, in 2012, about half of Russian corporations didn't undertake any investments in productive capacities at all. According to some results of some studies and research of Russian investments, we see the decline of production in machinery and engineering in Russia during the radical market reforms. And we see deterioration of the supply of machinery production, which reflects the interests of our big business, of our big corporations, which are not interested in first quality equipment produced in Russia, and who often prefer the obsolete equipment or second-hand equipment, and they introduce obsolete technologies when their equipment is stripped away. The quality of Russian investments is very low. In March-April 2011, only 22 of Soviet enterprises in Russia did not need any modernization of their productive capacities, and the rest were in a need of partial or complete modernization of their productive capacities. But only 12.5% of the Soviet enterprises or their managers maintained that their organizations undertake any solid investments and secure complete modernization of their equipment and production. Nearly 90% or more of enterprises just maintain their current level of production and capable of securing only partial improvements in their productive capacities. Even official data suggests that in 2000s, physical wear and tear and not maintaining competitive level of competitiveness on the world market was the major reason for replacing equipment in Russian industry. The majority of Russian enterprises, about 90%, keeps purchasing new or second-hand Russian-produced equipment, while surveys show that Russian managers consider this equipment as inferior in comparison with imported from Western countries. Some studies they demonstrate that reducing quality of equipment is one of the major ways major ways of Russian engineering how to adjust to the decline of in demand for investment goods on the part of the Russian industry. There are data which show that such cheap types of investment, which is practiced by Russian big business, helps to diminish by 2 or 3 times in costs of investment per capital item. This means that if the same companies would invest in best technologies and best equipment, they should spend 2 or 3 times more on their investments in productive capacities. So they prefer inferior investments because they are much cheaper. I would say that independent experts do not take at face value the official data on longevity of fixed capital in modern Russia. And independent experts think that currently the average longevity of equipment in Russian industry exceeds 20 years, while in 1990s, on the eve of radical market reforms in Russia, this figure was only about 10 years. This result was achieved at the beginning of the 2000s, and this enormous pouring of petrodollars on Russian economy, this didn't help to change this very sad situation. We are still very far from real modernization of our economy. So it is an empirical fact that after so many years of so-called recovery, even before the world economic crisis, and it is even more obvious after the world economic crisis started, that investments of Russian enterprises is insufficient not only to stop shrinking of fixed capital stock, but even to prevent it from technological degeneration. And I think that this is the major conundrum of Russian capitalism. It is a conundrum from standpoint of the mainstream neoclassical theory, because Russia carried out all the principles of the so-called notorious Washington Consensus, on which the agenda of radical market reforms of the 1990s was based. And still, after implementing all the demands of neoclassical theory and based on this theory, market reforms agenda, we are still far behind our competitors, and modernization is proclaimed only as a future aim of our society. I think that in order to solve this conundrum, we need to pay some attention to genesis of Russian capitalism. And along with some scientists, I see the 2 principal sources of modern Russian capitalism. One of them is the influence of the globalized and financialized world capitalism. And the other source is internal, the generation of the Soviet system, especially of the Soviet bureaucracy, which contributed and made it very lasting imprint on the nature of Russian big business. And I think that these 2 major currents of modern history, they virtually determined the nature of Russian big business and its model of corporate governance, and set its objectives, and determined eventually the type of deficient economic growth in Russia. If we pay attention to the current state of big business in the United States, then in reality it is very far from proclaimed neoclassical model of rational economic man and of big business, models of big business based on this premise. In fact, if we look at the investments in structure of investments of non-financial American corporations, we will see that until the 1970s, internally generated funds were invested in fixed assets, much more than in financial assets. And all this changed in 1980s and especially in 1990s, where these two indicators became nearly equal. And sometimes net acquisition of financial assets even started exceeding investments and in fixed assets as a percentage of internal funds. This is a very important fact. I think it is much more important than other dimensions of financialization, such as growth of derivatives and growth of the credit market and other kinds of financial speculative capital. Because this is an effect and influence of Wall Street on Main Street America, on non-financial corporations. Now look, these are the results of such change in the structure of investment policy. In the 1950s and 1970s, financial assets as a share of tangible assets in US non-financial corporate sector oscillated between 30 and 40%. But look, starting from 1980s, the situation changed dramatically. And the relation of financial assets to productive assets in American non-financial corporate sector changed to the opposite. And on the eve of the current world economic crisis in 2006, this coefficient achieved an absurd level of 160%. This means that financial assets greatly exceeded the productive assets of American non-financial corporate sector. Now, in the structure of American industrial capital, financial assets exceed the value of productive assets. If we move to the second factor which affected Russian model of corporate governance, we should mention, I think, the idea of Thermidor, the bourgeois degeneration of the Russian Revolution, which produced the Soviet bureaucracy, such a privileged class of the Soviet society, which enjoyed both official privileges and growing informal command over economic resources. And this second factor, informal command of economic resources, became increasingly important with the degeneration of the Soviet system in 1970s and 1980s. In fact, Gorbachev's perestroika and democratization removed the threat of punishment for pursuing bourgeois values. It was real democracy in Gorbachev's time, I think much more real than so-called sovereign democracy in modern Russia. But paradoxically, it produced the opposite result in contrast with what we dreamed of. It produced not a sound democratic society, but it led to formation of a powerful pro-capitalist bloc between the degenerated, rotten Soviet bureaucracy and the criminal underworld, which was interested in privatization and removing the property from state ownership to private ownership. And in fact, this process greatly strengthened this tendency to informal control over resources which appeared in the Soviet time. Actually, in the radical market reforms, these two factors determining the nature of Russian capitalism influence of the globalized, financialized capitalism and degeneration of the Soviet bureaucracy merged and determined the nature of Russian model of corporate governance. And, I think that some sociologists who studied this process and who maintain that the Soviet bureaucracy as administrative class, some part of Russian intelligentsia, which is determined as appropriating class, and criminal underworld, they were the principal factors the driving force of radical economic reforms in Russia. These sociologists are quite right. And the actual form of ownership and property relations in Russia was shaped by privatization of the early 1990s. In contrast with the declarations of this process, in fact, privatization fixed the results of growing informal control over resources on the part of Russian bureaucracy. And it produced privatization, quick privatization, precipitous privatization, as it was said once, whatever the costs. And this created widespread opportunities for abuse of legal system on the part of state bureaucrats and criminals in Russia. And now the criminal nature of privatization is widely recognized both by foreign experts and officially by Stepashin, the head of accounting chamber of Russian Federation. At the initial stage of privatization, ownership structure of Russian enterprises was characterized by predominance of insiders, of workers, managers, and engineers of Russian enterprises. But in course of 1990s, this changed, and the property ownership and control over Russian enterprises was moved to people who were called external insiders, but who took over Russian enterprises. And I would say that the defining feature of the Russian model of corporate governance is reliance of big business on infrastructure of control over the enterprises. Under this term, I mean a set of formal but predominantly informal institutions securing personal control on the part of dominant groups over the assets. And look, we can single out the external elements of infrastructure of control, which are comprised of chains of ownership, cloud of offshores, according to Harper, one of Russian specialists in corporate governance. And then links to state officials, lobbyists within the state structures, and external defense of property rights, which assumes ties with law enforcing agencies and with some private security firms and with criminal organized structures. The main aim of external elements of infrastructure of control is to defend the property rights, the dominant position of real owners of Russian enterprises, their domination over the enterprises. But the infrastructure of control includes internal elements of control, which contain centralization of decision-making process, monitoring and auditing bodies, and internal security services. The main aim of internal infrastructure of control at Russian enterprises is to monitor and control activities of workers, engineers, and rank-and-file managers, to prevent theft and to impose the will of dominant owners. I think that infrastructure of control on the part of big insiders reflects the specific nature of the current Russian model of corporate governance. Unlike the neoclassical ideal of a corporation, this model of corporate governance is based on inseparability of ownership and control. Infrastructure of control is a kit of tools securing submission of hired labor under the capital by force. And in fact, I think we can describe Russian big business as heavily relied on extra economic coercion, which is contrary to all the principles of neoclassical economics and of widely publicized image of a capitalist society as a democratic in its nature. Primarily informal character of control over the assets in Russia engenders fundamental instability of the position of dominant groups. And this is confirmed by the fact that waves of redistribution of property rights, predominantly in the form of hostile takeovers, periodically roll over the Russian economy. And raiding became a separate and very big industry of Russian economy with its own market and with enormous capital turning over at this market, and it amounts to tens of billions of dollars every year. And in result of this fundamental instability of control over the Russian enterprises, we have very short-term oriented business strategies, and this is reflected in a particular type of income appropriated in Russian big business. And this type of income I would call insider rent, a kind of insider rent, because we should distinguish this from entrepreneurial profit. Entrepreneurial profit depends on the difference between revenues and costs of organizing production, while insider rent, although it is affected by this difference, but it is not limited by the difference between revenues and costs, because Russian dominant groups, they appropriate not only this normal entrepreneurial profit, but they also decrease wage fund, they diminish investment fund, they avoid taxes, they sometimes, in case of very short-term oriented myopia, they even appropriate credits, loans from banks, they violate obligations of firms, and they appropriated any kind of financial flows which are created by the enterprises. And about 30,000 enterprises in Russia were ruined to the ground, leveled to the ground in course of reforms. Part of them are ruined to the ground due to extreme myopia in managing them, and dominant owners extracted every kind of financial flows which was possible. Even in situations when dominant owners are interested in partial development of their enterprises, they still pursue medium-term oriented strategies, which imply that they do not introduce first-rate and first-class technologies and equipment. This leads to a number of corporate inter-firm or corporate conflicts in Russian industry. Conflicts of big insiders with workers, with minority shareholders, with rank-and-file managers, because insider rent implies that both wage funds, salaries, and profits which are distributed to dividends, these financial flows are at least partially appropriated and by big insiders and are withdrawn from corporations. And insider rent as a dominant type of short-term income appropriated at Russian corporations affects greatly investment strategies. Withdrawal of funds means that you curtail, reduce investment funds. It is obvious. But on the other hand, insider rent leads to reduction not only supply of funds, but it undermines demand for funds and demand for investments on the part of Russian enterprises as well. Because if our dominant owners are short-term oriented, then they neglect some very profitable investment projects for Russian enterprises with long-term payback periods. And usually, if you invest in first-rate technologies, in first-rate equipment, then payback period tends to increase. And this goes very often beyond the short-term or medium-term time horizon of Russian big insiders. And of course, corporate conflicts and widespread opportunistic behavior at Russian enterprises, which is based on this conflictual and contradictory nature of Russian big business. This undermines investments in all aspects as well. I think that if we look at the macroeconomic conditions in Russia, we will see that they are largely determined by price disparity in favor of extracting industries in Russia. And these extracting industries, they form the foundation of export-oriented sector of the Russian economy. And the groups of big insiders or real dominant owners in Russia who are based on export-oriented industries, they are the strongest among the Russian, in the structure of Russian capital, in the structure of Russian ruling class. And this is a very important factor because it reflects the position of the country in the world economic system, its periphery position. Because in the core countries, the capital groups which are based on manufacturing, they are the most influential. And in Russia, it is the other way around. It is because only industries with low level of processing the industries which produce the products with low level of processing, they have opportunities to export their products to the West. And this means that companies producing oil, some metallurgy companies and some chemical plants, they are the most profitable in Russia. And they tend to change the structure, to distort the structure, the price structure in the Russian economy in their favor. And this means that industrial production pays tribute to these sectors of economy, and part of the funds obtained from manufacturing is withdrawn from Russia and saved in the West. There are lots of data on capital flight from Russia, and export-oriented sector of Russian economy is the prime contributor to this capital flight. So these groups of Russian capitalists, they are interested in investing money in productive capacities only in raw extracting sector. And part of the inducement to make investments is to make savings in the West, especially in the United States. And all this reflects the peripheral state of Russian economy and its belonging to periphery or semi-periphery, as some scholars maintain. But still, it is a fact that Russian bourgeoisie behaves like lumpen bourgeoisie of André Günther Frank, who described this phenomenon basing on Latin American experience. On this picture, you can see some case example of struggle between different rival groups of big insiders. Their struggle for takeover of one of the best enterprises in chemical industry in Russia, Volgograd Khimprom. And this struggle completely paralyzed this very profitable at the time enterprise, and they withdraw all the money which they could. And this enterprise, which had its share of the world market, it had very obsolete equipment and very low wages, and their departments, scientific departments, developing new technologies and new products, they were reduced, and virtually now they are non-existent, and this enterprise paid very heavy tribute to Russian periphery capitalism. So, concluding, I would say that Russian capitalism is a kind of a periphery capitalism, and this is reflected in the nature of Russian big business and is the major institutional obstacle to modernization in Russia. Thank you.
Please, your questions. Please, Professor Novoi.
Ruslan, is it have experience of calculate of the rate of surplus value in modern Russia or not yet?
No, I think it is very difficult. I think to calculate surplus value exactly is absolutely impossible, not only in Russia, but in any country of
Everywhere.
Everywhere. It is possible to have some relative approximate estimation of profit. When you say about rent-seeking behavior, it is much more difficult, because inside the rent it's something which is not obvious. Russian big insiders are not very eager to show how they withdraw and appropriate money, and because it is illegal or semi-illegal activities. So it is very difficult. We can rely only on some indirect data. And I think that, for example, the capital flight from Russia, which is, if we take such article of the data of Russian central bank as net export of private capital from Russia, and it is estimated officially from 1994 to 2012 as approximately $372 billion. This is a rough estimate of insider rent saved in the West, I think.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm very curious because you started your presentation with a story about Russian entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
and it was sort of microeconomic approach, because
Yeah.
this story was about individuals who share attitudes and behavior. But you concluded your story with rather macroeconomic things, like you were talking about institutions, rules, constraints. So my question is about the nature of the behavior of Russian entrepreneurs. How do you think, whether they really rational actors who are perfectly aware about this big picture and just try fit in, or maybe they are irrational actors, they simply have some, I don't know, informational
Assumptions.
biases, or I don't know. Maybe they just don't know about this picture you just demonstrated, and therefore they constantly repeated
Yes.
these mistakes of economic behavior.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I deliberately based my macroeconomic picture on microeconomic picture. It is the Marxian type of approach, which is contrasted to neoclassical approach. In neoclassical economics, you have separate micro and separate macro, and we Marxists think that it is wrong, because you have to define the nature of capital and the particular kind of capital relations in a particular economy. And from this you can derive the major features of macroeconomic policy and environment, and of the type of economic growth. So I think that the behavior of Russian capitalists is the major, and interests of Russian capitalists is the major factor on which the whole economic picture of Russia depends. And I have problems with defining it in terms of rational or irrational, because I need to know what do we mean by rational economic behavior. If you mean Max Weber, rational capitalism means that revenues should exceed costs. Then behavior of Russian capitalists is irrational. If you define the rationality as pursuing private interest, disregarding all consequences, then behavior of Russian capitalists is quite rational, because they are posed in conditions of periphery capitalism. It is impossible to accumulate capital to maximize your private income in such system, basing your activities only on introduction of new technologies, organizing business processes, and so on. You have to rely on extra economic coercion in conditions of any peripheral country, I think, Russia including. So this economic behavior determines the price structure, the distribution of finances among industries, investment strategies, the structure of fixed capital stock in the Russian economy, and eventually it strengthens the peripheral position of Russia in the world economy. This is my vision of Russian capitalism.
This is your question.
Yeah, you just said about non-economic coercion, non-economic factors of function in Russian economy, and all these factors, economic, non-economic, can make some unexpected results. Like, for example, in the center of your picture is several what we call oligarchs. So people or person who manage everything. And we know that even in the time of crisis, some oligarchs in Ukraine just increase the values several times. So crisis is positive for them. Another oligarch said that I am for democracy, because after the Orange Revolution, the capitalization of my enterprises in Ukraine just grow and grow. So I am happy of democratization, at least formal democracy. So my question is, what do you think? What is the main problem? Main problem of Russia economy? I mean, you know, some people said even here that we need, from our government, they said we need only money.
We need
only money.
Only money.
Only money, we need nothing more. We need money from World Bank, from IMF and so forth, and then we will decide everything. But as we see in Russia, Russia government had some money, this stabilization fund, and also some problem. So what is the main problem of such economy? In institution, or maybe managerial culture, or maybe the quality of population. I mean education. I mean values. What is the main obstacle? Why Russia is not a normal capitalism?
It is a philosophical question. I'm not sure that I am ready.
No, it's not a philosophical. It's a very practical. It's a very practical question.
But philosophical is quite practical for us. Yeah. You see, I think that in very final account, of course, quality of population of us as people determines everything, because our ruling classes, our government is only a reflection of political culture, and political culture is based on our general culture. In this sense, we are all to be blamed for everything which happens to the wars in our world. But if we somehow narrow our focus with only economic phenomena, then I think that the determining factor is the nature of labor-capital relations in a particular capitalism. And in Russia, these relations, I believe, are based on what I try to reflect here, on extra economic coercion, which has some historical, sociological, and political preconditions and aspects which influenced this type of relations between people, which are quite authoritarian, which are oppressive and inhuman, and all kind of condemning bad words can be used to describe these relations. And I think this is the core of Russian capitalism. And from this you can derive everything: the objects of Russian enterprises, the nature of investment strategies, the structure of the price structure, distribution of financial flows in Russian economy, and all other features which define economic growth. I think this.
Yeah, thank you. It means that there are some fields for sociologists just to study such things.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have to proceed to the next presentation.
Well, thank you.
Please, Professor Ruslan.